We can think of these new generation Asian tech companies coming to the region very intent on hiring local executives that can navigate between cultures. And they actually empower them with the strategic planning and decision-making level work scope, and for that matter, actually hearing them.
The expansion before the pandemic was opportunistic, was a bit cocky, and the expansion now is out of necessity. And after the pandemic, people's risk appetite has changed. They want to de-risk. They want to find the right people.
Hello and welcome to Brazil is Not for Beginners. Today we have an exciting episode. We're going to talk about Asian tech in Brazil. I have two extra awesome guests today. Roberto Borcic is an Ecuadorian expat living in Brazil. He is a partner at Pullman Morrison, a Singapore-based executive search firm focused on the Americas. And Jianggan Li. Jianggan is the founder and CEO of Momentum Works, a Singapore-based venture outfit. Jianggan also has a lot of tech experience before that. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for the invitation, Isaac.
Yeah, I'm really excited. This is really cool. We were talking before this call, and I think we've been having conversations generally, the three of us, about the growing number of Chinese automobiles in Brazil, how the tech companies are growing, how they're recruiting in Brazil. I think this is a really topical subject for us to talk about, and I'm really excited. Before we go into how tech companies from Asia or how Asian companies generally look at Brazil, maybe the two of you can provide a little bit more background than the brief bios I gave there. Roberto, would you like to start?
Sure. A pleasure to be here speaking with you guys. Making a brief introduction here. I am Roberto Borcic. I am an Ecuadorian expat living in Brazil for more than 10 years, and I am the partner responsible for the Americas operation of Pullman Morrison. We are an executive search firm with headquarters in Singapore and operations in Hong Kong, China, and Brazil. I was born and raised in Ecuador. It's a funny thing to mention here because on the 10 years that I've been in Brazil, alongside all the time that I lived in my home country, I think this helps to have a different perspective about what is Latin America. Here in Brazil, I started working in executive search from a very young age, and I decided to focus on this profession because it's something that helped me develop a very vast network. When I came to Brazil, I was someone that had almost no connections. I thought that it would help me grow my circles, start to get to know more people and to connect better with Brazil. At the beginning, this was something that I wanted to do, for a short while, just to expand my professional network. But I kind of fell in love with this profession and I decided to stay in it. So I've been for almost a decade working within executive search.
It's funny how those things happen, how you do something temporarily to learn something and fall in love with it. It's a really cool background, and I'm interested in how you ended up at Pullman Morrison focused on working with Asian companies, right? I don't think it's exclusive to that, but obviously with a base in Singapore, that's a key part of what you do. And as Asian companies come to Brazil, that's really interesting. And I want to dig deeper. But Jianggan, it'd be great to hear a little bit about your background and how you came to focus on what you're doing now at Momentum Works.
Hi, I'm Jianggan. I have not seen any namesake in my entire life, so people find it difficult to pronounce my name. But I was born in China and moved to Singapore when I was 16 years old. Studied computer engineering from a university here. Then I have been having a career which sent me into different parts of the world. I've lived in India, I've lived in Dubai, I've lived in Hong Kong, and briefly in Beijing. So I did INSEAD in 2013, and afterwards I joined Rocket Internet. And the first venture I was doing for Rocket was Easy Taxi, which was obviously based in Sao Paulo. And that was a very interesting year and a half experience. First, all the calls at weird hours from Asia. And second, I realized that you can't depend on developers to fix bugs during the World Cup, during the Carnival, during the Christmas. So basically, you have 6 weeks out, you can't find people.
You've got to have your priorities, Jianggan. It's important to have your priorities.
Yeah. That's something we realized that I think people here in Asia work too much, and we don't talk about any other priority rather than work. So I started Momentum Works in 2017 after leaving Rocket, initially as a venture builder. So we focused a lot between 2017 to 2020 to build companies in Indonesia, another large market. And we were fortunate to have one of our companies acquired at the beginning of the pandemic. And afterwards, we took a step back and looked at opportunities where we could participate. We sort of position ourselves nowadays as a venture outfit. We do a little bit of investment. We still do a bit of building, but it's not a big focus. And we have a few like the cash generating businesses, which is the first time I'm doing that. I mean, since like 2013.
That's great. And you guys put out really amazing research on the Asian tech scene, and quite a bit of it in Spanish and Portuguese as well, which is really cool. And one of the reasons I wanted to invite you here. You guys both have really cool backgrounds, as I mentioned, and I think we'll bring a really complementary perspective as we discuss this. Before we get into what's happening in tech now in Brazil and how the Asian companies are looking at it, some of the themes we've talked about already, live commerce and e-commerce, obviously. What can you two share a little bit more generally about the Asian perspective of Brazil? I guess, is there one? And how has it evolved? What does your average person in Indonesia or in China or Philippines or Singapore think about Brazil? I can say, as an American, before coming to Brazil, Brazil is known for their soccer team and carnival. Maybe somebody's heard of bossa nova. It's and we've talked about this on previous podcasts. It's a giant country. It's massive. And sometimes outside of Brazil, for various reasons, the depth of the culture and the size of the country are not very well known. So what is the general perspective that you think Asian people, and obviously that's a broad generalization, but what is the average perspective of Brazil in some of these Asian countries? Maybe Jianggan, if you wanted to start there.
I think it started with football. Basically, when I was a kid, back in 1994, 1998, I mean, you watch like the World Cup, and then you see the team from Brazil, and some people are actually becoming fans of the style, of the freedom, of the expression of the footballers back then. So that was, I think, the average people's perception of Brazil back then. I think for business point of view, for a long time, people know Brazil as a big exporter of agricultural products. I mean, because you see things on the shelves of supermarkets which are coming from Brazil. But I think for most people in different parts of this region, Brazil is far. So I personally know an investor friend who almost got into an early stage investment in 99 taxi in Brazil. He works for a USD fund from Shanghai. And the reason why he missed this investment is that he couldn't get his people to travel 36 hours there to actually speak with the management properly before pulling the trigger. So eventually they didn't do the deal. And of course, afterwards, I mean, the company was acquired by DD. They would have made a good return. But there's a distance, right? People feel it's far, far away.
Gotcha. Roberto, anything that you want to add there in terms of what you've seen as you look at recruiting for companies from the region?
Yes, so just adding to what Jianggan said right now, I wanted to start with some curious facts about Brazil. So I don't know if you guys have thought about this earlier, but did you know that in São Paulo, there is the biggest Japanese community outside of Japan? And it's actually fun because Japanese cuisine here is amazing. And countries like South Korea see Brazil as a model for their own agricultural development. So these fun facts that I researched about, and of course, the ones that I know and enjoy here, like Japanese cuisine, are some interesting data that shows how connected Asian and Latin American cultures can be. And jumping back to your question, adding to what Jianggan said, on the several opportunities where I have dealt with Asian stakeholders, I perceive that, unfortunately, like in the US, there is very limited understanding about Brazil. So knowledge in Asia is oftentimes limited to stereotypes or to small sources of information that usually gravitate around samba, tropical weather, soccer, carnival, exotic animals. And the average Asian person may not realize Brazil's position as a regional economic powerhouse. So just like Jianggan said, Brazil is very known for their commodities. It's a huge country and a vast producer of several kinds of commodities. And on the last decades, China has been a key player in shaping how the Asian view of Brazil is perceived in other countries of the region. The thing here is that being a major trade partner, this translates on the fact that most of the times Brazil is still discussed in terms of economic opportunity connected to natural resources. So it would be agricultural resources, maybe like the example before, maybe oil and gas, petroleum. It could be iron ore. We have Vale, for example, one of the world's biggest iron ore producers. But in terms of economic opportunity connected to, Brazil's rich culture and thriving technology sector, I think we had other first comers or other players that came to Brazil earlier, maybe a lot of companies from the US, but I think Asia is catching up and very fast in pace. So on a recruiting perspective, I could tell you that we have two cycles, maybe. We will probably speak a little bit in detail about this later, but giving you a bit of what I think about this, a lot of Asian companies that came to Brazil on a previous cycle, maybe a few decades ago, 10, 20 years ago or more, they came to Brazil with a more command control kind of mindset and management styles. While the new generation of companies, especially the tech companies from Asia coming to Brazil, have learned the lessons. Most of times, these lessons were learned in a hard way. And they have started to recruit their executives with a different perspective, trying to empower the local management teams for them to take decisions locally. When I say this, it kind of seems obvious, but for a lot of time, the local companies and the local management teams from Asian headquarters had no authority or had no empowerment to take decisions, to drive the strategic planning for the region. And most oftentimes, they needed to replicate what headquarters decided, even though maybe the data was not the best, or maybe because headquarters did not trust completely in the non-Asian executives that they had here in the region. So I think there's some interesting cues here for us to discuss. Maybe we can elaborate a little more about this later. But on a recruiting perspective, I think we have a lot of opportunities here for the Asian companies coming to Brazil. And also on the other side of the table for local Latin American and Brazilian companies that want to explore opportunities in Asia.
Just to mention about the Japanese community in Brazil, this is actually quite interesting. I remember a few years ago, I was in Sao Paulo with a bunch of other Asians, and I speak Spanish, but I don't speak Portuguese. And of course, the two languages are different. We went to a Japanese restaurant in Sao Paulo. I can't remember whether it was in Libertache, the Japantown, or outside, but we went in and they started serving us sushi. And there were like different kinds of sushi that I had never encountered in Asia, right? You have, pineapple slices on top of rice. Yeah, we don't really have in Japanese restaurants in Asia. But what's most interesting for me was they just kept serving and we didn't order anything. So at some point in time, we sort of figured out maybe that restaurant functions like churrascaria, right? I mean, you have to tell them no before they stop serving. Otherwise, dishes would keep coming. But it shows a very interesting like cultural adaptation of Japanese cuisine in Brazil. And that has, I think, permeated over the generations. And of course, Roberto, as you just mentioned, many of the executives, many of the companies from Asia expanding into Brazil or any other market, they're relatively new. And their success in their home market in China or South Korea or whatever, it just happened over the last decade or so. So lots of them are still learning the lessons of how to navigate different styles, different cultures. I have seen examples of companies saying that this is a particular Chinese company in Thailand, but I think the lessons are the same, right? So we hire local management and we give them complete trust. But the problem is that the local management and you grew up in different context and your professional life is different. So a lot of times that initially you want to give a lot of trust, but you don't actually make effort at ongoing basis to understand each other. So what eventually happens is that a year and a half or 2 years down the road, you will say that, oh, I gave this guy all the trust and he didn't deliver. And the guy is saying that, yes, you give me the trust, but you don't give me any resources. How can I deliver? So we see that actually happening a lot. And as you said, I think companies are now learning from this kind of mistakes.
Really great points on both sides, I think. So first of all, that's one of my favorite fun facts, the size of the Japanese community, Roberto, as well. That's always something that people don't expect, that don't know much about Brazil. And the food is really spectacular. In Jianggan, it is hojizio. So they do that for all sorts of food. You can do it for pizza. You can do it for sushi. You need to be careful where you walk in because it's really easy to overeat in Brazil. But picking up on a couple of the points that you made, and, Roberto, you talked about how some of the tech companies are switching from more of a command control to giving more liberty, maybe hiring locally. I think traditionally a lot of Asian companies would send over executives. And Jianggan, you touched on a couple of those points. And this is another broad question. I think we're going to be talking in broad brushes regardless today. But how do Asian tech companies view Brazil, and how has that evolved? So when a company is looking at expanding into a new market, what are they looking at Brazil for? And how has that changed from maybe some of the more traditional Asian companies, even, the telecoms like Huawei or something like that, to now a TikTok or a BYD or those types of companies?
Let me take a step first. So to understand why these companies go to Brazil, and probably you need to take a step back to understand what they are facing back in their home market. So Roberto, you mentioned about the two waves of Asian companies going to Brazil. And actually, even in the tech, I think I would further classify that into two subwaves. So between 2014 to 2019, before the pandemic, I would classify that as the first subwave, where the Chinese companies, especially, they're super confident about themselves, and they start to say that, okay, I'm successful in China and I have global ambitions, and I want to explore other markets as well. And what they typically do, they look at a map to see where are the people. So in 2016, everybody went to India, but it turned out the Indian government was not liking it. So they banned TikTok, they banned lots of things. So that became really hard for decent Chinese tech companies to operate in India. And in 2017, 2018, everybody started looking at Indonesia because, you go down the ladder, right? Everyone perceived that US market is too difficult to tackle. You have strong competitors. But then you look at India is the largest population, Indonesia's next. And many people went into Indonesia. And this is a very interesting revelation that one of the executives who have been operating in Indonesia from China, but also had some exposure to Latin America, was telling me that. He said it's really, really difficult for Chinese businesses to compete in Indonesia. I said, why? He said, of course, people talk about infrastructure, people talk about geography, it's archipelago and stuff. But have you not realized that the top business groups in Indonesia are run by ethnic Chinese? They know exactly what you are doing. And whatever you think that you are strong at in terms of technology experience, they can learn it very fast. So that made it very difficult for many of them to compete in Indonesia. Of course, a few large ones like TikTok, like the e-commerce platforms, they would have sophisticated operations that is difficult for Indonesian Chinese to replicate. But still, so people are looking at, okay, what's next? And of course, you look at the population, you look at GDP per capita, you look at population density, and people look at Brazil. So you probably have had a bit of experience of looking at some of the Chinese companies going into Brazil. You have Didi acquiring 99. You have Baidu, which set up operations there. You have Kwai, which is a TikTok competitor. And what I heard is the reason why TikTok put so much focus in Brazil is because the leadership heard that Kwai was making a lot of progress in this region. They said, okay, there's no way that we can let Kwai win in Brazil market, so let's pour more resources in Brazil. I think that was the first impetus for TikTok to invest extensively in Brazil. So that's the first wave. The second wave is now, right? After the lift of the restrictions of the pandemic. So what's happening in China? You guys probably have read in headlines, right? The domestic growth has kind of stagnated, and the government is putting some restrictions on tech, more on the sort of excesses that they have in tactics in growth. And that forces a lot of different businesses in tech and otherwise to look for other growth engines. So I would say that, the expansion before the pandemic was opportunistic, was a bit cocky. And the expansion now is out of necessity. And people actually, as Roberto said, have learned some lessons. And the businesses that I've talked to in recent months, when they talk about international markets, they talk about risks. They talk about having the right people. And before that, the people were talking about, time machine. So we have mastered this business model in China, and we need to transplant that into other markets. You don't hear that kind of talk anymore.
Adding to what Jianggan said right now, I think we are facing some very relevant geopolitical situations worldwide. And with the increased global tensions that have, driven Asia to look for diversification on its partnerships, Brazil becomes also a very clear target for expanding their operations, because it's a country that is relatively neutral in political terms. This helps for the country to be an attractive option for expansion. And we can also look at Brazil as a country that has a lot of underdeveloped frontiers with immense opportunities, especially when we compare the country to more mature markets in the rest of the world, like maybe Europe or the US. So, for example, here, adding a little bit of data to what Jianggan just explained, I would like to, share some of Brazilian tech market insights. So, when we speak of Brazil, we're speaking of a country with more than 213 million inhabitants. Over 70% of the people here in the country have internet access, especially through mobile phones. And this digital connectivity within this immense addressable market makes Brazil a very interesting and ripe country for companies that maybe sell consumer goods, that maybe deal with tech or with media or other sectors. So the interest of Asian tech companies is growing a lot. We also see the interest of local or maybe companies from the region, not just of Brazil, offering services like banking and financial products, for example. So in Brazil, approximately 21% of the population remained unbanked as of last year. This accounts to an impressive number of 45 million inhabitants. Making a fun comparison here, this would translate to 4.5 times the total population of Sweden, that has 10 million inhabitants, or maybe 35% bigger than the entire Texas state in the US, with 29 million inhabitants. So Brazil is undoubtedly a country that has very relevant numbers here. We also can see Brazil as a country that has a lot of, let's call them problems, but there is a lot of tech companies willing to solve these problems and probably bank from this. So it is known worldwide that Brazil is a country that charges very high values in taxes, but underprovides in terms of services like transportation, public safety, logistics. And although Brazil has SUS, or SUS, a worldwide recognized public healthcare program, there are still a lot of gaps that need to be filled within healthcare. Just giving some examples here of sectors that could translate into opportunities.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And first of all, I really appreciate your political skills in speaking of the world events and the problems in Brazil. Really great subtlety there. I really appreciate it. But I think also, Brazil, I think you touched on it really well there, Roberto, in terms of the confluence of people having access to finance for the first time, as they're also really big early tech adopters. So the number of people that are on WhatsApp, that are on TikTok, that are on these platforms, Brazil was always early adopters. I'd never heard of Orkut until I came to Brazil, which was this big Google plan that only existed in Brazil, it seems. It was a big competitor to Facebook for a long time, but this willingness to be online and this interest in tech is really amazing here, coupled with the financial inclusion, creates real opportunities. And kind of building on what we were talking about with how Asian tech companies are looking at Brazil, I'm interested in how have they been approaching their market entry strategy? What are they doing to kind of carve out their space here? So, Jianggan, you mentioned Kwai was big here, and so TikTok threw money at it. But what else is behind that? Because you see a lot of big companies. You see Shein, you see Lala move in the delivery space, Didi with 99, the car companies. Every day I see more BYD and Great Wall Motors. What is behind that market entry strategy, and how are they doing that? And Roberto, I'm imagining you have quite a bit to add about how they're building teams here.
Of course. So, if you let me jump in here for a second, I could maybe provide some insights about the local tech companies from the region that have grown in Brazil and that in some cases established the pillars or the ground base for Asian tech companies to follow or to, grow along. So, we can think of some very interesting and very well-known examples here of successfully cultivated local unicorns. The obvious example, Nubank, a fintech company revolutionizing the banking sector here and growing in Latin America already, in Mexico, Colombia, etc. We have Rappi that came to Brazil and grew very fast here. They are a delivery app that has expanded its services far beyond just food delivery. They even just recently hired Mercado Libre's CFO as their new CFO. We can also think of Daki, which is making waves in the quick commerce space. We already spoke about 99, that is a ride hailing app that also was recognized as Brazil's first unicorn at the time that Didi made the acquisition of the company. And we also have a very curious example that is called eBanks, a fintech company transforming the payments landscape in Latin America. And they operate at the forefront of facilitating cross-border transactions by enabling businesses around the world to accept local payment methods in Latin American countries, something that previously was very difficult for external players looking into Brazil. So when we see these companies and what they have built, I think that a lot of Asian companies that are coming or that came to the region have kind of followed the playbook that these innovators of the region laid and created, because they having the local knowledge, having the local expertise, and having the local talent, it made it quite easier to these local players to develop their businesses and grow. Maybe Jianggan wants to add something here before I speak a little about recruitment in these companies.
When Jack Ma first studied Alibaba or first studied Taobao in China, and people were saying that, okay, how can you compete against eBay, which is this big behemoth, which just acquired a leading company in China? And remember back then there was this saying, Jack Ma said that, okay, they are the shark in the ocean, we are the crocodile in the Yangtze, and of course we know our water is the best, and we can navigate that better than the sharks. So, of course, there's one problem with the translation of that, because the animal that they find in the Yangtze were actually alligators, not crocodiles. But that's probably not the point here. But the same issues that Chinese companies, when they try to expand into other markets, they face the same issue, especially in large markets, right? So their understanding about the market is always limited compared to well-funded and driven local entrepreneurs, and their ability to absorb information, unless their leaders are personally on the ground. These leaders are amazing people. They build companies from 0 to 100 or maybe 1,000. So they are nuanced enough, they are driven enough, and they're determined enough. But this is also related to, as your question about a market entry strategy. When you enter multiple markets outside China, the leader himself or herself, to make it correct, would not be able to spend enough time and attention in a single market. That's why multiple market entry is always difficult, right? So the question becomes, back to your space of expertise, Roberto. How do you build a team led by someone who has the ability to do 0 to 1, and who has the ability to do 0 to 1 at the same time navigating the complexities of this large organization you have already built in your home country? Chances are you are not, getting this person to build a completely new startup. You are getting this person to leverage your existing resources, your existing expertise. Maybe it's supply chain, maybe it's tech expertise, maybe it's product, to build this. So how does this person fight for resources within a group? That goes back to all the corporate issues, right? You are in a large company, how do you fight for resources, etc. So also in terms of market entry, you would have I would say two types of companies, right? The mention about Huawei, the mention about the automobile companies. These companies, they have a product which they are trying to sell into a country. So they do B2B relationships, they do channels, they build distributorships and stuff. And in a way, that's not that different from how they do things in China. But when we look at tech companies, many of them are trying to build an ecosystem, which requires a lot deeper local understanding and local team. Because, think about food delivery. Can you imagine a Chinese player to go to Brazil to build a food delivery? It's actually a lot more complicated, right? Because you really need to build a supply, build a demand, build the rider force. And it's not like you build a super good product and then you find a distributor to sell. It's very, very different levels of complexity you have to deal with.
Adding here, I would like to speak about the 0 to 100 road that Jianggan described a little earlier. In recruiting terms, we have helped a lot of our Asian clients, not just here in Brazil, but also in the region, to hire these broken in two kinds of profiles. So we can think of the launcher profile, this is someone that will help the company grow, maybe in a country, maybe in a region. It depends on the size of this operation. So for Brazil, maybe we could have more than one launcher broken into regions. And these people are responsible for helping the company grow from 0 to 1. So maybe they are generalists. Sometimes they come from strategic consultancy backgrounds or from operational backgrounds. And they have something where they are strong in. So I will speak about the profiles after a minute here, but we also have the general manager profile. So sometimes after the launcher helped this company grow from 0 to 1, the general manager, someone more senior, more experienced, oftentimes hired from a direct competitor, will help this company grow from 1 to 10 or from 1 to 100. In a few cases, maybe the launcher can grow into this role also. And when we think that for these strategies, talent is key, Asian players looking to grow into Brazil and Latin America will be very benefited by hiring top-level professionals that can act as a bridge between different worlds. So when I mention a bridge between different worlds, I'm thinking that from a headhunter perspective, I can give you my opinion based on two profiles or personas. One that is like the culturally rigid executive who has struggled or may struggle in the future trying to grow in Brazil, and the other about the cultural bridge executive. Let me elaborate here for a second. The first one we could connect maybe to this previous generation of Asian companies that operated or are currently operating in Brazil. Of course, I won't point fingers here, but just explaining a little, we could say that this command control mindset that the Asian companies had when they came into Brazil in these previous generations made them hire local executives. But these executives had no voice over the decision-making process, like we spoke before. And oftentimes, they even had an Asian shadow alongside them, usually their boss with a similar role. And these shadows were the ones approving every decision and speaking directly with headquarters. This was a huge problem for these companies because the local talents ended up being limited in their actions and could not contribute with their inputs about their local knowledge of the Brazilian landscape, cultural differences, communication styles, local management insights, and oftentimes they even were bypassed in the decision-making process by headquarters. This all translated into the culture of the company getting transformed into a very rigid one with low motivation levels within their local teams and executives. And the strategies were oftentimes built upon HQ desires from Asia, but not always connected correctly with the local consumers or even the local data. In some cases, this translated into huge financial investments made, reaping low or even negative returns. And like I said before, I won't give examples of this scenario, of course. But for the second one, this would be this new generation that Jianggan greatly explained, broken into two moments, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. We can think of these new generation Asian tech companies coming to the region very intent on hiring local executives that can navigate between cultures. And they actually empower them with the strategic planning and decision-making level work scope. And for that matter, actually hearing them. These executives can adapt to different communication styles and tend to be very data-driven. For example, here in Brazil, in cultural terms, we usually enjoy creating rapport, speaking a little bit about our personal matters, about our life, our hobbies, etc., kind of creating a personal connection before doing businesses. While in Asia, communication can be much more straight to the point, brief, and with clear commercial objectives in mind, without investing much time in personal rapport. So this cultural bridge executive most oftentimes tends to be very talented generalist that can navigate within, Brazil's main entrance barriers. We spoke about some of them previously, like, for example, taxation. Curious fact, taxation by itself translates into a local multi-million-dollar legal services industry just to help local and international companies understand and navigate this complexity. There's also the language barriers, local culture, local business and political landscapes, etc. And these cultural bridge professionals or executives have great communication, reporting skills. They are usually very data driven and base their decision making processes on data. I like to joke with this, saying that Asians may not understand Brazil, but these Asian tech companies are very good understanding data. So data is key for this communication. And of course, translating Brazil in simple terms to headquarters.
I think data is definitely important here because it creates a single unified way of language that each party understands, regardless of the context we are dealing with. What you just mentioned about building rapport, there's one point I want to add here, because when people talk about business here, especially in China, people talk about this concept of guanxi, right, which is rapport and relationships. And I think just now, Roberto, you mentioned that this is not necessary. So I just want to clarify a little bit, because it is important when we deal with business counterparts, with regulators, with governments, but people do not see the need to build this rapport within a team. The team inside is a command and control structure. So this is a bit nuanced and different. I still remember back, like I think back in 2014, when I was working for Easy Taxi, we had, I think for one of the teams in Brazil, we hired a East European, I will not name which country, to manage that team of 10 people. And I think at the end of like 2 months, like more than half of 10 people wanted to resign, because they said our new boss is too rude consistently. And I think then the management did a little bit of investigation. They realized that, I mean, he's not being rude, he's just being Eastern European, right? I mean, straight to the point, looking a bit cold, looking a bit depressed, and that doesn't connect with the team in Brazil.
Really like the points, and I liked your comment there, Jianggan, about data being a unifying language. Just going a little bit deeper on this part, where have these companies succeeded in, Roberto, you talked about hiring different types of profiles. Where have the companies that have succeeded done that well? And where have companies failed? And what's contributed to that? And I'll follow up with another question after this one.
Well, Isaac, when we think that the Asian companies learned their lesson and now they are thinking different in how they operate in other regions, especially when we talk about Brazil, I think that this understanding that having executives that will be empowered to take local decisions and to help build the strategic plan of the companies. Of course, here we are speaking of the highest level of governance within these companies, so the actual decision makers of the local operation. Understanding that these professionals will have the huge challenge of translating Brazil to Asia and vice versa. I actually break up this cultural bridge profile I described to you before, because sometimes it is actually not a single individual within the company, and this could instead be a group of talented people working together for achieving a common goal. And when these people gets hired by the company, they establish a culture, and when they start building their teams, they bring similar mindset people to the team, so this culture thrives and the company starts operating this way. So when I break up the cultural bridge professional into sub profiles, we can think of the adaptable professional. This one embraces new cultures, are eager to learn, and they readily adjust to different communication styles. So you could think of this one as a well-rounded generalist. We can think of the strategist. These ones have a strong understanding of the Brazilian market and can translate Asian business goals into a successful local strategy. Usually, these kind of profiles have a deeper hard skills toolset, let's say, and usually they are very good with data. We can think of the bilingual bridge also. So these kind of professionals are fluent in Portuguese and an Asian language, fostering better communications within the company and creating a smoother transition for their Asian colleagues when they enter the Brazilian market. We can think of the collaborative team player. These ones thrive in multicultural environments and they can bridge communication gaps and value teamwork to achieve goals. So all of this could be one person. It could be maybe a general manager, or this could be an entire organization where some directors, some managers, maybe the president or general manager have these kind of characteristics that helps the company thrive.
I actually have a question here. So the person or the persons you've described, I think they're extremely rare to find. And if I'm an Asian tech company, say I'm TikTok, I go to Brazil, it's not that hard to convince someone who is of this caliber to work for me. But if I am, I don't know, the largest supplier of a specific battery kind of component to BYD, if I go to Brazil, it will be probably quite hard for me to hire a talent of this kind of caliber, right?
Yeah, sometimes it is. So that's where we get into the equation. Usually, these tech corporations, these Asian companies coming to Brazil could be very benefited by, partnering with the right service providers for finding this talent. So what we have built here at Pullman Morrison is a platform that enables us to operate in any time zone, connecting Asia with Latin America. Our headquarters are in Singapore, but our Americas operations are here in Sao Paulo. And from here, we cover Brazil, Latin America, and the US. And what I think we are very good in doing for our clients is solving complex problems through enabling them to hire the best talent to solve this. So, as a fun fact, Executive Search was born more than 60 years ago as a spin-off from, strategy consultants from MBB players. And they found out that a lot of their clients, besides the strategic pitch decks and the strategic plans that the consultancies could develop for them, they also had very strong and very big problems about recruiting talent. And they said, hey, why don't we build a consultancy business that gravitates around this problem? So I think something that was lost during the decades in my industry, and I've seen this in Brazil very clearly, is quality and, being a consultant for your client and not just someone that will deliver CVs, and actually understanding the corporate governance, the culture of the company, their strategic objectives. We don't do financial advisory, but at least understanding a little bit of their numbers, and what they are looking to do as a company, not just for your country, but globally and within their business units, with their products, thinking of their clients, thinking of their suppliers, thinking of their competitors. When you put all of this in a very complex equation, and just after studying all of this, you start speaking of a profile, then you are doing, in my point of view, correct executive search. So that's what I think we provide to our clients here.
I think this is supremely important because I talk to lots of Chinese businessmen and who are looking at expanding globally. The biggest challenge that many are talking about is, do I have the right people? Because I mean, as you rightly pointed out, they have seen the mistakes of their peers, and also as we mentioned just now, that after the pandemic, people's risk appetite has changed. They want to de-risk. They want to find the right people. They want to tune their organization to the right way so that it suits actually global operations. So this is something that people place a lot of importance on. In addition, I think there's another thing which I'm not sure if you guys help as well, which is actually the ongoing expectation management. I remember there was this guy, a friend of mine. I will not name which company he works for, but he works for a Chinese company operating in Latin America and headquartered in Beijing. So he told me that to make his work effective, he spends 1 week in Brazil, 1 week in Mexico. These are the two markets they were operating in, and 1 week in Beijing. And I was stupid enough to ask him, hey, how about the other week of the month? Because every month he spends 3 weeks. He said, you do the calculation, and the other week is on a plane. So because if you travel between these three places once every month, you practically spend 1 week on a plane. So, but that kind of ongoing communications, face-to-face time to sort out differences, to manage expectations, I think is also quite important, especially the distances are so far.
I've been facing this currently working with our clients. And, we have calls that are with China, with us in Brazil, with the US, with our team also in Singapore. So we have a lot of time zones. And I think technology has enabled us to do this on real time without having to take a plane and travel for more than 30 hours for a meeting. But still, this is a very fun thing to do. And it's also very complex when you think that you need to connect stakeholders from different regions, interests, cultures, ways of communicating. And this was something I faced actually as a talent. So on the other side of the table, when Singapore headquarters reached out to me to recruit me as their partner here to help them with the startup of our local operation. So when I spoke with you about this concept that I have of the cultural bridge professional, although I don't speak Mandarin, for the region, I speak Spanish, English, and Portuguese. So for America, I think I have a little bit of linguistic coverage here. Our team also has a lot of talent that speak two or more languages. I think we can cover very well what our Asian tech clients need in terms of hiring talent.
Sorry, just very interesting that the headhunter has been headhunted. I just found it
Yeah.
fascinating. And the negotiations must have been very interesting.
Yeah, and actually, I just remembered I wanted to give some tips for candidates that are looking for these very exciting opportunities that are appearing within these global tech corporations from Asia, because that's something that I lived. So when I did my process on the other side of the table, so a very rare situation for me, I usually am the one making the recruitment processes here. But I think some tips that I could give are first translating the opportunity that is being presented as a candidate into something that connects with their local way of doing things, their local expertise, their local knowledge, and of course, their CV, their career, and what they can offer as executives, but try to translate this into ways that fit culturally with the Asian player that is trying to recruit them. I think also giving some key points that could demonstrate how interested they are in the opportunity and showing how excited they are about the company and what the company is looking to build here in Brazil is something that could add a lot of points. Also, a very obvious tip, but I always share it with our candidates, is studying very well the company, of course, and their objectives, if there is any available info, and showcasing how they are keen on working for a fast growing Asian company entering the Brazilian market. So basically, I'm telling tailor your interview process, speaking the truth, of course, and adapt your interview style to consider cultural differences, focusing on assessing and explaining both your soft skills and cultural adaptability alongside your technical expertise. I think this sums up the kind of tips that I would give for this very specific scenario of being an executive that is making interviews for working. It could be maybe in one of these launcher or general manager roles that we spoke about earlier, but this could also be applied for managerial roles or for director roles. So for any kind of role that involves an Asian company coming into Brazil, these small tips I think could make a huge difference in how the company sees the candidate.
Excellent. Related to things both of you have brought up, and I'm going to position it in a way that you guys will probably give different answers, but I think they'll both be valid. What are some of the concerns that Asian companies still have about Brazil? And so, Jianggan, you mentioned the distance and a couple of different perspectives, but what are the concerns that Asian companies still have about Brazil? And how should, a little bit more to you, Roberto, potential candidates or potential partners that are looking at these companies think about how they can address those concerns during this interview process or during this recruitment process?
I think that the concern is really about market potential or the expertise of the company to be able to win in that market or to be able to compete effectively in that market. In addition to the language, the distance, etc., I would think that another big concern for them is that how to navigate the political landscape. Because now, I mean, people see what TikTok has been facing in other countries. People hear about the new tax regimes for cross-border goods into Brazil. People hear about, all these talks from politicians, the elections. And of course, it's not that I think Chinese businesses do not like democracy is I think like any other business they want clear rules, right? They want predictability, so they don't want rules to be changed because of new guys being elected, etc. So quite often I think the concern is that, I mean, do I have the right skills, do I have the right nuances, do I have the right people to help me navigate all these complexities?
Adding to this, on a headhunter perspective, I think one of the main problematics that companies face when they try to come to Brazil or they decide to come to Brazil is actually people. I think every company I don't think I'm very positive that every company is built by people and for people. I think we are still living in a world where things gravitate around the human being. So the ability of hiring qualified talents with the ability to speak their languages and with correct cultural alignment, and also being capable to work with Asian and local teams, is one of the main problems that these companies face. Also, this is something where we at Pullman Morrison can help a lot, of course. But I would say that what we have been helping these companies do, and we have also seen other Asian companies doing, is bringing expats or maybe descendants of Asian countries that live and know very well the local country, in this case, Brazil. So we have huge expat communities here, especially in Sao Paulo, that is an international hub for business in Latin America. And it's the main hub here for the region. So when we think of all the expats that we have here, we have helped our clients hire on the first or second tier, or maybe in both, people that speak the languages, that understand the culture, but that if they didn't grow in Brazil, at least they have been here for a lot of years. So they actually know and understand both worlds. What these companies usually do is hire their leaders. So maybe the GM or president, maybe more senior directors will be connected to Asia this way that I described. And from this point downwards in the organization, then the company turns Brazilian, let's say. So this helps a lot, making the cultural bridge profile hires that I described before. And this is a way that these Asian companies can find this very particular and, I must confess, not so easy to find kind of talent.
I would say this kind of talent is, I mean, in my experience looking at many Chinese tech companies outside China, I wrote a whole book about it. This kind of talent is very useful for them, and it's much better compared to senior executives from their home country, because what I typically see is the commitment level of the executive sent from the home country to the destination market, right? You send someone from, say, from Beijing to Brazil, and you don't know how he would like Brazil. I mean, chances are many of them would look at Brazil as a market. They will see themselves as launcher, right? So I go there for 2 years, I hit all my KPIs, I get a promotion, and move back home immediately whenever there's a chance. But we look at those people, maybe, I don't know, Chinese nationals who studied Portuguese in Macau and then decided to go to Brazil after graduation. And their whole career is tied to their skills about understanding the Portuguese-speaking countries, understanding the culture of Brazil. And those people are much more committed to the market and much more committed to making a market work compared to someone who just treats it as like a 2-year stint in the market.
Really, really great stuff, guys. I once again made the mistake of inviting people that have a lot to share into a short podcast. And so running long in terms of the podcast, but I hope everybody's enjoying it. Heading towards the end here, I always like to ask people, the name of this podcast is a famous expression, Brazil is not for beginners. What does that expression mean to you when you hear it or say it to people?
Well, if you let me start here, since I've been in Brazil for a long time, I think this is a good one because I've lived in this country for long enough to see that at the same time that the people here can be very receptive, they can very happily embrace you, they can be very welcoming. The local way of doing things can also be very confusing. So you can hear a com certeza from someone said to you with a big smile. Com certeza translates to yes with all certainty, but you could actually be hearing a hard no disguised. There is always this, vamos marcar sim aquela reunião, that translates into, of course, let's schedule this meeting that will never actually happen. And I must be incisive here saying, please do break the ice. Please make rapport. Here it is called quebrar o gelo. This is when you meet someone, getting to know this person a little bit, having some chit chat, getting to know if this person likes football. It may be a positive thing. And this all will help you create a better connection, because here in Brazil, going the all business, not chit chat approach may actually pass the impression that you are being rude. Like the examples we had before, or that maybe you are not interested in the other person. I must confess, this is just scratching the surface about daily interactions with people. If we could schedule maybe another episode of the podcast, we could do an entire conversation just about the Brazil is not for beginners phrase. So just a second here, making a brief comment about all the previous episodes of your podcast that I have been hearing on these last few days. I need to make a congratulations here for you because this is a real problematic. There was not good content about Brazil out in the market before you started doing this. So I really encourage people to continue hearing what you're building and hearing what you're bringing to the table here.
Thank you.
And of course, to subscribe to your podcast.
Thank you for doing my advertising. You're hired. If the executive search game fails, you can join me as my promotion too.
Probably not paid, but
Yeah.
Hopefully not, but I can still help as a collaborator.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Jianggan, what does the expression mean for you? Brazil is not for beginners.
I think you have occupied this mind space with the podcast, which I think is very good. And last few days, I listened through some of the previous episodes. I think this is a worthy undertaking that you are doing. I have exposed to expansion efforts in markets large and small. And this is something, of course, each market, large and small, has its own set of like local nuances and complications. But there's something which is distinct about large economies or large countries with a distinct culture where people have this kind of I don't know how to describe it, but you see them, you see the vibe they give is different from small countries. I classify Indonesia as large country. I classify Brazil as large country, which means that these countries are not built for others. They have their own set of ways of doing things. They have their own set of ways of evolution. And by saying that this is not for beginners, it's something that you have to adapt if you want to succeed in those markets. And it's not impossible, but you need to dedicate enough mindshare and headspace towards that.
So first of all, thanks so much for the compliments, both of you. I knew I invited the right guests that would make me at least feel good about myself. So thank you. But I want to pick up on this last piece that you mentioned there about those nuances and traits in every market. And I always like to end the podcast by asking people if there's any common Brazilian traits that stand out to them. Roberto, you mentioned the point about the vamos marcar, which was something that somebody brought up previously. Are there any other phrases or behavioral traits that you saw in your time in Brazil that you see dealing with Brazilians that you think is important for other non-Brazilians to understand, or Brazilians to understand that they're doing this to other people and other people might not pick up on it?
Yeah, so jumping a little into this point here. Actually, when I came to Brazil, I lived in Rio de Janeiro for 5 years approximately, and I've been in São Paulo for more than 5 years also. So I've heard quite a lot of, local slang or gírias in Brazil. And I chose quite a few more on the business side. So I'll give you some examples that I think are interesting. So we could think of matar no peito, which literally translates into kill on the chest. This is more used in soccer. So I chose as a first example something related to football, since it's one of the things that Brazil is most recognized for. But matar no peito on a business context would translate into taking a challenge directly and confidently, which might contrast a little with the more consensus-driven and risk-averse decision-making processes in some Asian cultures. We can speak about tocar o barco. This actually means or would translate into push or to navigate the boat. This means to keep things moving or, continue working on something. It's something very pragmatic and a keep going approach that might contrast with the careful planning and consideration that is more typical to Asian business practices. So here is like, you have the job, solve it.
Great. I want you to save the other one so people have a reason to call you. Jianggan, anything that comes to mind for you in the time you spent here?
I have learned quite a few curse words, which I'm not going to repeat in this. But the point that Robert, you mentioned earlier about, how to sort of build and maintain personal rapport, even within a team, right? Even sort of within a structure where there's a hierarchy. I think that's kind of important for Asian businesses when we look at Brazil. And also, I think for people in Brazil working with bosses, colleagues from other countries, especially from Asia, is that this is not something that people are used to. So maybe it's something that you should consider when your boss sounds very rude to you. Sometimes it's not because he's bad. It's not the style that he's used to.
Yeah, the rapport and team building is something that's come up a bunch of times in these discussions and is obviously something I've experienced being here. And I think I know I've mentioned this on previous podcasts, but the fact that most of the companies give you food vouchers and you go eat lunch with your colleagues, I think that's a really important moment. It doesn't seem like it because you're going for lunch, and sometimes it's a long lunch when you feel like you should be working, but it's really important to that team building mechanism and to having those moments of knowing about, what soccer team does somebody root for, or, somebody's kids or their family, and being able to have hard discussions later on, even because you've built the rapport with people, and then navigating both sides of the coin. So coming from being a foreigner, but building that rapport to then maybe go back to some of the traits that you want to bring as well from your culture. So guys, thank you so much for joining me. I know this was a longer podcast. Thanks for everybody that's still listening as well. Last here, just at the very end, you both had a lot of knowledge that we didn't even get to. How can people reach you if they'd like to learn more about what you guys do or engage with your companies? Jianggan, your venture builder, and Roberto, you at the executive search.
Well, from my side, I could be reached out through LinkedIn as Roberto Borcic or at pullmanmorrison.com for anyone that is interested to find more about us and our work.
And the other Brazilian phrases, right? You shared it with me. You have a solid list there.
Oh, I can get us quite a few.
So first, you can find out more about the research and report we put up at a website called insights.momentum.asia or the lowdown.momentum.asia, which is our blog. So you can find some of our random thoughts there. And to reach out to me personally, LinkedIn would be a good tool. You can find out, I think, pretty easily find my name because I don't really have a namesake.
Not too many Jianggan Li's on there. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun. Lots more to unpack. I hope we can do this again at some point and look back at how we did and how things have evolved since. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That'll be fun. Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us. This podcast was hosted by me, Isaac Matzner. It was produced by Amanda Villela and edited by Veronica Medina. You can find more episodes on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as on our Substack page. We love feedback, so please feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email at Brazil4beginners@gmail.com.